Charlie Watts, the quiet backbone of the Rolling Stones, was admired by millions for his steady rhythms and timeless style. Yet before his passing, he shocked fans by admitting there was one drummer he could never measure up to, someone he believed stood in a league of their own. This revelation not only humbled his legacy, but also revealed a rare glimpse into the private insecurities of a rock legend. Charlie Watts was never the loudest member of the Rolling Stones, nor did he ever want to be. While Mick Jagger commanded the stage and Keith Richards embodied the rebellious rock and roll spirit, Charlie remained quietly at the back, steady as a heartbeat. His style was understated, yet essential. Without him, the Stones would not have had their signature groove, the subtle swing that made their music both infectious and timeless. What set Watts apart from other drummers of his era was his background. Before joining the Stones, he had trained as a graphic designer and played jazz in London clubs. Jazz was his first love, and its influence shaped everything about his drumming. Where other rock drummers pounded with force and volume, Watts approached the drums with restraint, precision, and elegance. He understood that sometimes less was more, that a perfectly timed snare hit could drive a song more powerfully than a flashy solo. Yet, for all the acclaim he received, Charlie Watts never bought into the myth of his own greatness. He frequently described himself as just a drummer, insisting that his role was simply to keep time and hold the band together. To fans, critics, and even his bandmates, this humility only deepened their respect for him. Keith Richards once said, "Charlie Watts is the Rolling Stones. Without him, there is no band." But behind that quiet humility was a man who still carried his own doubts. While the world called him one of the greatest drummers in rock history, Charlie quietly compared himself to others, particularly the jazz giants he had grown up admiring. In interviews, he often downplayed his achievements, pointing to the musicians who had inspired him and saying they were the true masters. This sense of modesty wasn't just an act. It was deeply rooted in his personality. Watts had little interest in fame or wealth, even though he was surrounded by both. While his bandmates courted controversy and tabloid headlines, Charlie spent most of his life devoted to his wife, Shirley, whom he married in 1964 and stayed with until his death. He kept horses, bred dogs, and lived more like a country gentleman than a rock star. Fame, for him, was never the goal. It was simply the byproduct of playing the music he loved. Still, even as he built his own legacy, Charlie could not ignore the drummers who came before him. He studied their techniques, listened to their recordings, and measured his own playing against theirs. And in the end, there was one drummer in particular whom Charlie openly admitted he could never match. This confession shocked fans, because it revealed a vulnerability that few expected from a man who had defined rhythm for one of the greatest rock bands in history. When Charlie Watts spoke about his heroes, he often mentioned names from the world of jazz rather than rock. Unlike many of his contemporaries who drew inspiration from Elvis or Chuck Berry, Charlie's musical DNA was steeped in the rhythms of bebop and swing. Among those giants, one name towered above the rest: Buddy Rich. Buddy Rich wasn't just a drummer. He was a force of nature. Known for his lightning-fast hands, flawless technique, and larger-than-life personality, Rich could command an entire stage with nothing more than his sticks and a drum kit. His solos were legendary, pushing the boundaries of what people thought was possible on the drums. Even in his later years, Rich could outplay drummers half his age, leaving audiences in awe and fellow musicians humbled. For Charlie Watts, a man who valued subtlety and restraint, Rich represented something almost untouchable, a level of technical brilliance that felt beyond reach. Charlie often admitted that he admired Buddy Rich's ability to dominate without ever losing control. "I could never play like that," Watts once confessed in an interview. "I don't have the speed, the flair, or the power he had. I've always been more about keeping time." Coming from a drummer who anchored the Rolling Stones for nearly 6 decades, those words reveal just how deeply Charlie measured himself against the jazz legend. But it wasn't only Buddy Rich's technical skills that impressed Watts. It was the way Rich embodied confidence and charisma. While Charlie sat quietly behind his kit, almost invisible in the shadows of Mick Jagger's wild performances, Buddy Rich stood front and center, often turning a drum solo into the highlight of the night. This contrast fascinated Charlie. He didn't want to be like Rich, but he couldn't help but acknowledge the gap between them. Still, in his humility, Watts never saw this comparison as discouragement. Instead, it was motivation. He didn't try to copy Buddy Rich. He knew that would be impossible, but he used that respect as fuel to refine his own style. Where Rich dazzled with speed and fire, Charlie grounded himself in rhythm and swing. He found beauty in restraint, in leaving space for others to shine. In many ways, his decision not to compete with drummers like Rich was what made him so distinctive. The irony, of course, is that while Charlie believed he could never match Buddy Rich, countless fans and musicians believed no one could match Charlie Watts. His unique sense of timing, his refusal to overplay, and his quiet discipline made him the perfect drummer for the Rolling Stones. Rock history proved that you don't need to be the fastest or the flashiest to become a legend. Still, it's telling that even in his later years, after the Stones had been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and celebrated around the world, Charlie Watts continued to hold Buddy Rich on a pedestal. That humility, seeing himself as a student rather than a master, was part of what made him so respected by fellow musicians. Charlie Watts's career with the Rolling Stones is often described as a paradox. On one hand, he was part of the most famous rock band in the world, playing to millions of fans in stadiums across continents. On the other, he carried himself with the demeanor of someone who almost didn't belong in the circus of fame. While Mick Jagger thrived on attention and Keith Richards leaned into the chaos of rock and roll rebellion, Charlie stayed quietly in the background, his expression often unreadable, his movements minimal. He played his part, and then, when the show ended, he returned home to a far quieter life than his bandmates could ever imagine. That humility was not a performance. It was who he truly was. Unlike many musicians who fought for the spotlight, Charlie often appeared almost uncomfortable with fame. He didn't want interviews, he didn't bask in applause, and he certainly didn't crave the excesses of the rock and roll lifestyle. In fact, he spent much of his career trying to separate himself from that image. He preferred the life of a family man, deeply devoted to his wife Shirley and their daughter Serafina. While other members of the Stones made headlines for scandals, Charlie was more likely to be spotted at a horse stable than at a Hollywood party. And yet, this humility didn't mean he lacked confidence in his abilities. Charlie knew exactly what he brought to the Rolling Stones. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't try to compete with the louder drummers of his generation. Instead, he leaned into his jazz roots, creating rhythms that swung with a subtle groove rather than pounding with brute force. That restraint became his signature, and musicians around the world recognized that his drumming was deceptively complex. What sounded simple was actually masterful, an art of holding back, of playing just enough and never too much. Even so, Charlie's own insecurities never left him. He continued to hold up drummers like Buddy Rich as examples of what he couldn't do. To fans, this seemed absurd. How could someone who had kept the Rolling Stones alive for 60 years feel inadequate? But to Charlie, it was a matter of perspective. He didn't see himself as a star drummer, but as a working musician doing his job. That outlook kept him grounded in an industry that consumed so many of his peers. Interestingly, it was precisely this humility that made him so beloved among fellow musicians. Many drummers admired his ability to stay consistent and disciplined in a band known for chaos.
Dave Grohl once said that Watts had one of the most solid grooves in rock history, while countless others credited him with influencing their own playing.
His legacy was not about speed or flash, but about consistency, feel, and restraint, the qualities that kept the Rolling Stones' music timeless. What's striking is how his humility extended to personal interactions as well. Stories from those who worked with him paint a portrait of a man who was always polite, always kind, and almost shockingly normal for someone of his fame. Even when he admitted that Buddy Rich was the drummer he could never match, there was no bitterness in his tone, only admiration. That perhaps more than anything explains why Charlie Watts was so respected. He was proof that you could be a giant in music without ever needing to act like one. When Charlie Watts passed away in 2021 at the age of 80, tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. Fellow drummers, rock legends, and even jazz greats all agreed on one thing. Charlie wasn't just a drummer, he was a cornerstone of modern music. For nearly 60 years, he had anchored the Rolling Stones, not with flamboyant solos or attention-seeking tricks, but with a steady rhythm that let the band shine. And yet, to the very end, he carried himself with the humility of a man who believed there were drummers he could never match. That humility has become part of his lasting story. While he often spoke with reverence about Buddy Rich, insisting that Rich's technical brilliance was on another level, the irony is that countless musicians now speak about Charlie Watts in the same way. To younger generations of drummers, Watts himself is the unreachable standard, the musician who proved that you don't need to dominate a song to define it. His drumming was about service, about making the music better, rather than making himself the star. In that sense, Charlie accomplished something even Buddy Rich, for all his virtuosity, did not. He became inseparable from the very identity of one of the greatest bands in history. What makes his story even more powerful is how he managed to keep his humanity intact. The music industry has a way of consuming its stars, tempting them with excess, breaking them with fame, and leaving them hollow. Charlie Watts resisted all of it. He stayed married to his wife Shirley for nearly 6 decades, a rarity in rock and roll. He remained loyal to his passions outside of music, horses, art, and jazz, without ever letting celebrity dictate who he was. His drumming was steady because his life was steady. He gave stability to a band that thrived on chaos. In his final years, as the Stones continued touring, fans marveled at his resilience. Even when health issues forced him to step back, he did so quietly, with the same grace that had defined his entire life. There were no dramatic statements, no demand for the spotlight. Just a man who knew his time was coming to a close and was content with the legacy he left behind. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. Charlie Watts spent his entire career believing that Buddy Rich was the drummer he could never match. Yet in the eyes of millions, Charlie Watts himself became the drummer no one else could match. His humility became his strength, his restraint became his genius, and his quiet presence became his legend. Today, when people remember the Rolling Stones, they think of Mick's voice, Keith's riffs, and the swagger of rock and roll. But beneath it all, they hear the steady heartbeat of Charlie Watts, a drummer who never needed to be the loudest to be the greatest.